Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this blustery day in January. I want to welcome you to the Kamm Lecture Series, and I am Linda Bluso, Chair of the Business Division at Baldwin Wallace College. Peter Raskind, he's sort of a legend in the leadership arena in Cleveland. One of the themes of the Business Division is about leadership, instilling a mindset of leadership with our students. And so I couldn't think of a better person to come and speak to the college about his leadership journey. Peter, you were a former chairman of National City Bank, chairman, president, CEO, during one of the most unprecedented financial crises in our country. We're going to talk about that, but we're also going to talk about what then led you onto a journey to do some incredible things with the Port Authority and then the Cleveland Public School System. So with that, I'm just going to throw out some questions to you, and we're going to have a little conversation.
Here we go.
Okay. So tell us about your growing up and where you went to school. Let's start there.
Well, we'll keep it short because it's not all that interesting. But I grew up just outside Boston, actually in a place called Medford, Massachusetts. Medford's not known for a lot other than Tufts University happens to be there. And it's kind of a suburb of Boston. Changed a lot over the years. In the years that I was growing up, it was kind of a working class, lower middle class suburb, and that's what our family was. So went to high school there at the local, public high school, Medford High School, which is still there, and then on from there to Dartmouth College, which with the benefit of some generous scholarships from the alumni and some student loans and some jobs, was able to take advantage of a really fine educational opportunity. Ultimately, I stayed on at Dartmouth also for graduate school. I went to the Graduate School of Business there, the Tuck School. And from there entered the working world, and in my case, commercial banking.
What'd you major in?
I majored in economics, surprise, surprise, and then concentrated in finance in business school. So, I didn't think my path was sort of that certain at the time. I just knew I was interested in economics. But as it developed over time, I got interested in the banking business. First, from an academic perspective, actually, I got really interested in just money in banking and the role that banks play in the economy. And then, by sheer coincidence, I ended up working in a bank for a summer, literally placed there by a temp agency because I could type. I mean, in those days, it was called typing, by the way. Now it's called, keyboarding or hunt and peck or whatever. But the two kind of converged, and I decided, I'm really interested in the banking business, and ultimately, that's what I decided to pursue.
Wow. So what was your first job out of college?
Out of business school, I went to Chicago, and I went to work for a bank that's still there, actually called Harris Bank. It's now a unit of Bank of Montreal, still there. Anybody who's familiar with Chicago would be familiar with Harris and their mascot, Hubert, the Harris Lion, which was a big deal in Chicago at those days. Wasn't there too terribly long enough to gain some really good experience, long enough to meet my wife, who's here today. And then went from there to a bank that at the time had a different name. And in the banking business, keeping track of the names and the mergers is like a full-time job. I wouldn't recommend it. But a bank that is now U.S. Bancorp, and worked first in Milwaukee for them for 4 years, then at the headquarters in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where we lived for 13 years, and then came to Cleveland in 2000 to join National City.
Is that how you found your way to Cleveland?
Kinda. The short story in Cleveland is my wife is actually born and raised here. Shaker Heights, we met in Chicago. We lived in Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis. We had no plans to move back to Cleveland. I mean, none. And then one day a headhunter called and said, I'm working on a job. And I said, I'm not interested. I'm very happy doing what I'm doing. Where's the job? And he said, oh, it's in Cleveland with National City. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And I could hear him perk up on the other end of the phone. He said, oh, you know something about Cleveland? Well, yeah, I have in-laws there, and I go there and visit once in a while. And then he knew he struck pay dirt. And we it was one of those situations where we weren't looking for it, but as we discussed it, we thought, if there's ever a time to move closer to family, that was it. Our kids were relatively little at the time. And so lo and behold, kind of on a surprise basis, we decided we're moving to Cleveland. And here we've been now for almost 12 years.
What kind of position were you offered?
At the time, it was, one thing about National City is the organizational structure kept changing, which has some pros and cons to it. But at the time, there was a business line called consumer finance, and it was a sort of a group of consumer lending businesses, credit card and student lending and auto lending. And I was offered the job of managing that group of business lines. And that was interesting to me because at that point, I had done a lot of different things in banking, but I had never done that. And I thought, well, they're willing to pay me to learn about another facet of banking that I haven't previously been involved in. Sure, why not? Let's go for it. So that was my first role at the bank.
At that moment, did you have any thought about becoming CEO of National City Corporation?
About this much. So I knew, and it was even discussed at the time, that somewhere down the line, succession was going to be a topic on the table at National City. And it was very clear at that point, and it was very intentional, that they were bringing in somebody from the outside to join the senior management team. It was the first time that somebody from the outside had joined that senior management team in anybody's memory, actually. And that was very intentional. But there were no assurances, there were no guarantees, there was no discussion of timing. I had no clue when Dave Davrico may or may not be interested in retiring. It was just, hey, this is a pretty good job. It fits some of our personal objectives, and then we'll see what happens from here.
So it was mostly for personal reasons you moved to Cleveland?
A combination.
Okay.
Combination. But the personal side of it was very important. My wife's parents were here, still are. They are our children's only living grandparents. Our children are their only grandchildren. So even then, we had a very conscious discussion that every day that goes by is a day we can't get back. And as it's worked out, that's turned out to be exactly right. Our kids do in fact have a bona fide relationship with their grandparents that I don't think would have been the case had we not moved here. So, in that sense, I think, we did accomplish what we set out to accomplish.
So what year was that?
That was 2000.
Okay. So give us a little summary of what was going on between 2000 and 2007 at National City.
Well, it would have to be a summary because there was a lot going on. But the short version is I had that role that I just described. In 2002, there was a guy who was managing what we called retail banking, the branch system and call centers and all that stuff that you mostly come in contact with at a bank, who left quite suddenly, very unexpectedly, which left kind of a gaping hole in the organizational structure. I had some previous experience with retail banking at US Bancorp, so I was asked if I'd like to move over and run that business line, which I very much wanted to do. And so in various forms from 2002 through really through the rest of the time I was there, I had responsibility in various forms for retail banking, and which is a business that I just loved for a whole variety of reasons. And it was a business at National City that desperately needed work. National City, for those of you who've been around Cleveland a lot longer than me, National City had always been at its core a corporate bank, and retail banking was an afterthought. And even inside the bank, retail banking was where you went if you weren't talented enough to be in corporate banking, and everybody knew it. Except the bank kept doing acquisitions, and the banks that were acquired were principally retail banks. And somewhere about 1998 or 99, before I joined the bank actually, the management team at the time looked up and said, we got a problem. We're buying banks and we're supposed to be adding value, and actually we're subtracting value because we're terrible at retail banking. So there was a distinct effort made to improve the retail banking business, and that happened to coincide, just by happenstance with when I took on responsibility, so that became my responsibility, and it was a ball because we really had to and had the opportunity to completely rethink that business and retool it. And again, for those of you who've been around for a while, you started to see things like we started to, for example, promote accounts where you didn't incur ATM fees because research said ATM fees are really annoying for consumers. You remember there was a whole rewards program called Points of National City. I mean, we started doing fun and kind of innovative stuff like that. In the banking business, that stuff's innovative. I used to say, it ain't an iPod, right? But it's not an iPad. But in the banking business, that stuff's actually innovative, and we just had a ball with it. And then on the inside, we were working very hard on cultural issues and other matters to try to advance the business, and we just made a ton of progress. So that was really great fun, and probably if in the end, if I could point to any single thing that sort of got me the CEO job, and there are days, believe me, when I wonder, gee, was that a good thing or not a good thing? But it was probably the success of, I think, retooling that business together with a lot of other folks.
So you did away with the toasters and the steak knives, and you came up with other ideas. Did you have a team that helped you work on that?
Yeah, and of course. One thing about the retail banking business, particularly in a large bank, is it's big. Retail banking at that time in National City had, I think, 13,000 people spread across 12 or 1,300 branches. So one of the challenges is, how do you manage something that is that spread out and that geographically dispersed and build a unified culture? That's part of the fun of it and also part of the challenge. And I think this is one of the points I always try to make. Whether it's a large business or small business, a college or university, nobody does anything by themselves of any value. And the whole notion of sort of the rock star, the iconic CEO or leader, I just don't actually have a lot of, don't put a lot of stock in that, because people don't accomplish things by themselves that are important. They do it with teams. And in our case, we had, in the end, some folks who had been there for many, many years. We brought in some new people. We sort of melded them together in some very intentional ways into a team, and we had a ball, actually.
So talk about you. What about what was going on at National City, and then how did you rise to become the CEO?
Well, I'm sure there's elements of that I don't know about and still don't know about to this day, and we'll never know. As I said earlier, I do think, as probably it should be, we had some success retooling that retail banking business. I think that was probably a big contributor from the board's perspective to, okay, this is a potential CEO for the company. And then, of course, there's other attributes that they're thinking about and are looking for. As it developed at National City, what ended up happening was the board invoked a sort of two-person horse race beginning in 2004, the end of 2004, if I remember correctly. Myself and another guy who was the CFO and also managed some business lines, and a good friend. And it was a very public, intentional two-person horse race, which, by the way, I would not recommend. I think it's actually a terrible idea. But that's what they did. And so for 2 years, this horse race kind of unfolded. And that has the potential to actually to be very destructive, and it has been in other companies. In our case, it was not, because basically he and I made a pact that it wasn't going to be, and we were good friends, and we stayed good friends. But at the end of 2006, the sort of choice was made, and I became president at that time, and I forget the terminology that was used, likely successor or something like that, and it was kind of clear that that's how it was going to unfold. But I think, as it would be the case with any leadership position, I presume they were looking for a combination of attributes. Success helps, accomplishments certainly, but also interpersonal skills, communication skills, presumably integrity and all the other values that matter that one would look for in a future leader.
So what was the culture like as the financial crisis started to unfold?
Wow, how much time do we have? I think it was in transition would be the best way I can summarize it. And I would say, actually, that was an industry-wide issue. That wasn't just National City. The culture was in transition in many different ways. The banking business, if you hark back, even in my early days in the business, I started in 1979, it was very highly regulated. In ways that you'd probably laugh at today, but in those days, the interest rate you could pay in an account was regulated. The number of branches you could have were regulated. It was extremely regulated, and then deregulated over time. And so, culturally, that had a huge impact. mean, I think you had a series of employees and managers who were passing through on their own journeys from a world that was very highly structured and regulated, and yet people actually who were kind of attracted to that, they liked that idea, to a world where creativity, innovation, energy, the opportunity to succeed, the opportunity to fail, was much more present. And we were absolutely in that transition. We were attracting new people who were very interested in the opportunity to succeed, but with an understanding that maybe they would not succeed. And we had legacy people, I think, who were less comfortable with that environment. And again, I don't think that was unique to National City at all, but very much in transition culturally and therefore organizationally and in every other way. And I think that was actually in many ways reflective of the whole industry. I think it's important to note too, when you think about the banking business, it's tempting to paint with a very broad brush. And I think that's a little dangerous in certain circumstances. There's much publicity these days around the very large, the New York banks and very large multinational banks. They're a bit of a different animal than a large regional bank like a National City or Key, and yet again a different animal from a smaller community bank like a Lorraine National Bank and many others in the area. And so I think painting with the same brush across all of them is actually in some cases not very helpful. National City was not Citibank and was never going to be Citibank, nor should it have been. But nevertheless, I think the whole industry was in transition at that point. And then, it's hello financial crisis.
So what were your concerns at that point?
In 2007?
Right, with the changing culture.
Well, I mean, my concerns were small and large. My largest concerns were, how do we make our way as I think what appeared to Clevelanders to be a very large regional bank, but frankly within the context of the industry wasn't that large a bank. How do we make our way in this industry in a way that makes sense for our investors, our shareholders, for our employees, for our communities, for our customers, of course, and what's the kind of right path, and how do we compare that to the path we're on? And we were in transition in that regard. I mean, we were coming into 2007 for a whole series of different reasons. We had a very large, relative to the size of our bank, a very large mortgage business, larger than I think we frankly ever intended it to be. And we were in the process of shrinking it intentionally because we knew it was too large. I've often said that in some respects I think we sort of got our tail caught as we were going out the door, because we were going in the right direction, but we didn't get there fast enough in terms of shrinking that business. And that was very problematic for us as the financial crisis unfolded. I guess the picture I'm trying to paint was everything was in transition, and needed to be actually. I think we knew where we were wanting to head, and we were taking steps to go there. What we did not count on, and I think hardly anyone did, what we did not count on was that this crisis would unfold with the severity and even the ruthlessness that it did.
Describe that, the ruthlessness.
Well, the whole topic of financial crisis, everybody's read a ton about it. We've all read the papers. Unfortunately, I think it is, for me, is one of those topics that by its nature is more complicated than is easily described in a newspaper story. And so my own observation is it's been boiled down and distilled in ways that I think are actually excessively simplistic, and it's turned into, the banks caused a financial crisis and then everybody else was a victim. My own view is that's not exactly the way it unfolded. Rarely are things this big and important quite that simple. Now, do the banks have a role? You bet. But I don't think life is quite that simple. I think the piece that is not at all well understood and was incredibly important. The economy's had cycles forever. Look, I've been in the banking business for 30 years. There's cycles where, credit was great and credit wasn't good, and commercial real estate was good and commercial real estate was a problem. That's sort of gone on forever. You expect that in the business. What was unprecedented, beginning in the summer of 2007 and continuing into 2008, and I still think and you'll correct me if you think I'm wrong, I don't think is well understood generally, was the liquidity crisis that was erupting in the summer of 2007. And that was the piece, I haven't met a person yet who can honestly say that they anticipated that occurring. We all knew housing prices were going to level off and probably fall. That wasn't that hard to figure out. What was, I think, very unexpected was that the financial system, the wheels of the system, would seize up, as they did in the summer of 2007, and then stay seized up in many respects to this very day. I mean, it actually, some of these markets haven't improved right to this very day, 3 years later. We didn't see that coming. I don't know anybody who actually did, who's honest. And that was huge, because it's one thing if an asset deteriorates in value and you have to sell it at a loss. Okay, that's painful. If an asset deteriorates in value and you can't sell it to anyone at any price, which is exactly what was occurring in the summer of 07 and 08, that's an enormous problem, and it feeds on itself. So the fear and panic that was pervading the market, I think, was a little hard to feel if you were sort of just walking down Main Street. But if you were in the business, sitting where we were sitting, or I know some of the people here in this room, it was palpable. And if you've read any of the books about the financial crisis or seen, Too Big to Fail, or some of these things, and by the way, I kept telling myself I'm not going to read any of these books, I'm not going to see any of these movies, and then I've read them all and I've seen them all because I couldn't resist. But I think Too Big to Fail actually, it focuses fairly narrowly on certain institutions, but it does a pretty good job, I think, of presenting the fear that was in the market, and frankly the panic on the part of people in the market and the policymakers in Washington, that the world felt like it was coming to an end. And I get that completely, because from our little seat sitting here in Cleveland, Ohio, that is the way it felt. Routine transactions not only weren't routine anymore, you couldn't get them done at all. Huge issue. And I think to the extent it felt like, as you were reading the papers and experiencing that time, that the folks in Washington were sort of throwing ideas, up against the wall to see what would stick, I think they were. And I actually don't blame them for that, because I think there was a real sense that we've got to do things, and some of them may work and some of them may not, but inaction is not an option, because the system has ground to a halt in ways that could literally take down the whole economy. So it was an amazing time. And I've said many, many times, I felt like I had a front row seat for history. I've also said many times I wished I was in the bleachers on many days, because it was very, very stressful. I mean, it's one thing to observe it, reading the paper, or maybe even observe it as an academic if you don't have a responsibility in it. But in my particular case, I did have a responsibility for 30,000 employees and millions of customers, and so it was massively stressful to navigate through that period. But the point I would emphasize is, if you've heard anything to the effect that during that period was, the near downfall of our financial system and economy, and you thought that was hyperbole, I don't think it was hyperbole at all. I think we were absolutely at the edge of the cliff looking over.
So why didn't National City get bailout money?
Well, so now we're onto something I can't really talk about. And I haven't talked about it, and I can't, and by all odds, never will be able to. Some of you may or may not be aware, but the communication between a bank and its regulators is very highly protected. Violating that is actually a criminal act. I'm not really interested in that. So there's very few things I really just can't talk about. That happens to be one of them. The one thing I would say, though, is to the extent you've read descriptions of this particular topic in the newspaper and elsewhere, I wouldn't necessarily believe everything you read. Let's just put it that way. The story is a lot, like everything else, a lot more complicated and nuanced than I think some of the stuff that has, supposedly leaked. So.
All right, so you get to the point where you had to make the decision that you had to sell. Tell me about that.
Well,
How'd you make the decision? Who did you involve in helping make your decision, and explain to the students what the process might have been?
yeah. So the punchline of this is in October of 2008, we announced that we were selling the bank to PNC, and today when you go around Cleveland, you see PNC branches, and I think the lobby out there says PNC, and I bet it used to say National City is my guess. So that's the punchline. For any major transaction, particularly a transaction with a publicly held company, process is very, very important. It's the right thing to do, and it's the legal thing to do with respect to the shareholders. So it's very, very important that all the alternatives are exhausted and that the board makes the most informed and appropriate decision that it can. And I'm no lawyer, Linda is, but my understanding, particularly of Delaware law, is that when that's done, boards are actually fairly protected if they've done the best they know how to do what's best for the shareholders of the company. So process is very, very important, and the way you do that is you hopefully have management who knows something about that, and you hire advisors who know what they're doing. In our case, we had, I think, very good advisors, investment bankers, lawyers, and we undertook a process where you go out and you solicit interest. Is anyone interested in a transaction with this company? And that's how you try to maximize value. And in that environment, by the way, that was enormously difficult, and there was no assurance whatsoever that anybody would be interested in a transaction at that time because there were some risks to doing that. But, and I can't get specific about names because I just can't, but suffice it to say that there were some interested parties, and ultimately with a fair bit of drama, some of which has found its way into the newspaper, we did make a deal with PNC. And it's the board, of course. People kept saying to me, why did you decide this? How did you decide this? I had a job to do as the CEO to facilitate that process and to make recommendations to the board to be sure. The board's the one that makes the decision. And I was a board member as well, but it's the board that makes that decision. By the way, I completely agreed with the decision, and it was a unanimous decision on the part of the board. This doesn't mean everybody liked it, right? So, it's a good example, at least to my mind, of on the one hand, I've never had a moment of regret in the sense that faced with the same set of circumstances, would we do the same thing again? Knowing what we knew at the time, because again, hindsight is great, but it's hindsight. Knowing what we knew at the time, in that set of circumstances, I would absolutely do the same thing again. There's not a shred of doubt in my mind, not a shred. Do I like it? No. Was I saddened by it? Terribly. This was an historic company that came to, in my mind, a premature end. But given the set of circumstances at the time and the set of possibilities, it was absolutely my judgment and the board's that this was the best thing we could do for our shareholders, certainly, but also, very importantly, for employees, for customers, for communities. And I actually believe that's been borne out. I think PNC's been a terrific corporate citizen here in Cleveland and elsewhere. We absolutely expected that as part of the transaction, and they've performed to that. I think overperformed. So, it's a tough one because we didn't want to do it, but we had responsibilities to fulfill, and I think that we, under those very, very difficult circumstances, we fulfilled them. And let me remind, for those who aren't remembering those times, the notion of outcomes that were worse wasn't just a hypothetical. Just before we announced this transaction, a whole set of really ugly things had happened. And not just maybe were going to happen, they'd actually happened. So in June of 2008, a bank out in California called IndyMac Bank failed. That was a huge matter with lines of people at branches to get their deposits. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were seized by the government. AIG was effectively taken over by the government. Washington Mutual Bank, which was many times the size of National City, failed in September 2008. Didn't get sold, it failed. The FDIC showed up at the door. That is the banker's nightmare. And so, the idea that it couldn't happen or wouldn't happen, it did happen, right? Now, we didn't know if that was going to happen to us, but you certainly have to consider the possibility that it could. And that possibility is so horrific to consider that, it was our judgment that we couldn't take the slightest risk that such a thing could occur. And at some point, it's out of one's control. And by the way, I haven't even mentioned Lehman Brothers, which is the focus of that movie, Too Big to Fail, which also, went in September 2008. If you haven't read the book or seen the movie and you're interested in these kinds of things, take a look. It's pretty dramatized, but the really key point is, and it's well, I think, portrayed in the case of Lehman, is they were in denial. And by the time they accepted what was happening, it was too late to do anything about it, because that's the nature of financial institutions. A financial institution exists only because everybody believes that it will. And the day that there's doubt about that, it's over. And there's nothing that can be done. And it's too late to even sell it, because who wants to buy a financial institution that is on its last legs? So those are the circumstances under which one makes tough decisions. And those were the circumstances we were facing. So, but it was, the morning that we had to announce it to the employees, I mean, it was devastating. It was awful. I went and I made this difficult announcement and did my best to hold it together, and then I ran up to my office and I shut the door and I stared out at the lake for about 2 hours, because I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to, I thought, my God, look what I just presided over. So yeah, I mean, it was terrible.
So you were out of a job.
Well, actually, I wasn't. In the end, I chose to be. In fact, if you go back, trivia that nobody would be interested in except my family, when the deal was announced, there's a paragraph, a sentence in the press release that says, I'm going to be a vice chairman of PNC, Financial Services Group, which was thrown in there at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And then, several days later, I met with the CEO of PNC and said, oh, by the way, now that we have this deal done, what were you thinking of there? And, it was kind of like, well, not much. So I said, okay, I can stick around and collect a paycheck but not do much. I'm not very good at that. Or take the opportunity to take a little different direction in life, and that was the choice I made. So the day the deal closed, I left. I could have stuck around and, done something that wasn't very meaningful. I decided it was time to, try something new and different. So on January 1st, 2009, I guess that's a holiday, but January 2nd, 2009, for the first time in, I don't know, almost 30 years, I got up in the morning and I didn't go to work at a bank, which was very strange.
So what did you think you'd do?
I had no idea. I really didn't know. I honestly didn't know. I presumed I would probably go back to work in a bank at some point, in some way. But I wasn't in a big hurry to do that at that point. I was sort of in a mode of, first, I just wanted to rest, because I was utterly exhausted from the experience, mentally, physically, in every way. And all the advice I was getting was stop and think, don't just jump back into something. So of course I almost did jump right back into something, and unfortunately I didn't. But I really wasn't sure where I was going to go from there. And Julie's here today. She can attest to this. If any of you are ever in this position, maybe you'll have the experience I had, which is, at 9 o'clock in the morning, I'd say, this is the greatest thing that ever happened. I can do whatever I want today. I haven't been able to say that in 30 years. And then at 9:30, I would say, this is the worst thing that ever happened. I have no idea what to do. How many books am I going to read? And so there was a fair amount of flailing around in terms of what the heck am I going to do, and some a few false starts. And then I started to sort of get some sense of direction.
So how'd you get to the Port Authority?
Well, like lots of things, I think, in life, some serendipity helps. Some of you may recall the Port Authority was facing some significant issues and had effectively let go its CEO. They were going to undertake a search for a new CEO, and I was just, I was reading about all this in the paper, and then, one day I get a phone message at home from somebody I knew who was on the Port Authority board, whom I won't name, Bob Smith, who's sitting over there, and I said, did you like this? There's a thing Bob Smith called, and I thought, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I might have an idea why he's calling. And in fact, he was raising the question, hey, would you have any interest in filling in on an interim basis while we search for a new CEO? And in fact, Bob told me, I think maybe even then, he said, by the way, I've been advised you'll have no interest in this whatsoever, but I feel like I got to ask. And I said, yeah, I might. I just might. And then there was a day or two of conversation with Julie, who correctly said to me, are you out of your mind? All you've been saying is you don't want to have your name in the paper anymore, and now here's an organization that's in the paper every day, and you're going to get back into that. But it was intriguing to me because it was different. I thought a way maybe to make a contribution and apply my skills, but also in ways that were very different than what I'd experienced in the past. And I thought, what the heck? As I've said to some folks, it was my version of a midlife crisis. I'm at that point 3 years old or something, and all I've ever done is work in a bank. I can do this. Why not? Why not give it a go? So I said, sure.
So how did your skill set apply to the Port Authority, from banking to the Port Authority?
Well, better than one might think, because the Port Authority, it's a really interesting entity. It's a public entity, but it's very much a business. And it feels like a business when you're within it, including, by the way, a lending business, which is pretty near and dear to my heart. The Port Authority does quite a bit of financing of economic development projects, but it also has this business of essentially running a port. And I won't bore you with the details. It doesn't directly run the port, but it contracts with people who do. And so it's much more like a business than one might think, although in a public context, which is very, very important. I learned very, very quickly. So what I learned was that, first of all, business skills mattered, particularly in that context. And then what I also quickly learned was organizational skills, leadership skills, management skills, communication skills, they matter everywhere and anywhere. And the ability to form relationships with the employees, trusting relationships, to figure out what to do. And in that instance, we needed to downsize a bit. We needed to make some changes. I had to go out and see our customers and give them some comfort that we were stable. Those are all, pretty comfortable things I'd done for many, many years. And I found were extremely transferable. Not everything. In a public context, there are things that are different. And part of what I had to do was very quickly, understand that and change some of my ways. Because in a public setting, you do everything in a public setting. It is, the behind the scenes, well, maybe we should think about this, and then, well, maybe we won't, or confidential stuff. That just doesn't work in a public setting, certainly not in the state of Ohio. So I had to adjust to that and adjust to the politics, which are much thicker than anything I'd experienced to date. But many of the skills are extremely transferable, actually.
But you had to make some really quick decisions and cutting like over $500,000 from the budget. How did you do that so quickly?
It wasn't that hard. And it wasn't that hard for a couple of reasons. One, there are always people within the organization who know what to do if you just ask them. and that was, the Port Authority is no exception. There were people there who knew exactly what to do. You just needed to ask them. And then the second part is simply having the will to do it. Make the decision and get on with it. And I know that isn't always the case. That's something that I've tried to adhere to over my years in business. Is when it's time to do something, do it. Even if it's difficult, confront it and get on with it, because we'll all be better off. These decisions never get better with age. They just never get better with age. And so the harder part wasn't figuring out what to do. The harder part is just doing it. What's amazing, and I've seen it either at the bank or here or the school district, it doesn't seem to matter, is if you can figure out what to do and do it with in a reasonably timely way, the respect you get afterward for having done it. People say, somebody needed to do something, by God, you showed up and did it, so I'll pretty much do whatever else you want to do from this point forward. It's huge. And I kind of knew that from 30 years of experience. And I just have a very strong, it's sort of in my DNA that, when it's time to do something, by God, do it. Confront it and get on with it. That's the job. If you don't want the job, don't take the job. And if you're going to take the job, do the job. And in this instance, it wasn't that hard to figure out what to do.
So how much were you paid for this?
Well, That's a leading question. I was paid $1, and I actually was paid $1. So I have the pay stub. Less taxes, I might add. One of my favorite little anecdotes is when Bob and I were discussing taking on this role, and I hope Bob won't mind me saying this, the board had been criticized somewhat for the compensation package associated with the previous CEO. That was very, very public in the Plain Dealer. And so when Bob sort of offered me the job, he said, here's what we're kind of prepared to offer you, and he named a number. Doesn't matter what it is now. And I could hear him on the other end of the phone swallowing hard because, my prior compensation at the bank was a matter of public record. It was more, and I said to Bob, well, let me think about it. I'll get back to you. So I called him back the next day, and I did something very cool, but I enjoyed it, which was I said to Bob, you know what? We're good to go. We're gonna do this, but we gotta talk about the compensation. I've got a counter offer on the compensation. I'm sorry. And I could just hear Bob going, oh God, this is going to be brutal. And I said, so here's what I would propose. I propose $1. And Bob said, are there any zeros after that at all? And I said, no, I think it'd be better for everyone, including me, frankly, if we just go at it this way. And I'm really pleased that we did, because it just takes that issue off the table of, oh yeah, here he needs to be paid this or whatever. And it wasn't about the money. And for the organization, I felt it was much, much better because they could also set that issue to the side that had been haunting them a bit. So yeah, so it was done on a volunteer basis, and in many respects that made it a lot easier.
So they hired a new CEO. You stepped aside graciously.
And happily.
And happily.
I was done.
And then what? Then what happened? Went home to rest again?
Well, partially. Along the way, I had sort of gotten into the consulting business, consulting to banks and to bank investors, private equity funds who invest in banks. And I was continuing to do that even when I was at the Port Authority, although it was hard because I was spending all day, every day at the Port Authority, but I had to kind of keep it going, keep the pilot light lit on that. So I was doing that, and sort of went back to that, if you will, and was perfectly happy to do that, and did that for, I guess, maybe 6 months following the exit from the Port Authority, till we get to the next thing. So.
Okay, so then Eugene Sanders, who's the superintendent, right? Superintendent?
CEO is the formal title.
CEO
interestingly,
of the Cleveland Metropolitan School District abruptly announces that he's leaving.
Yeah.
And then, did you get another phone call, or did you make that call yourself?
Well, there's a longer story here than is worth time, but I was thinking about other things that might be interesting to do in sort of a public service context at the time. And there were people here in town who I was talking with just to get advice, particularly people associated with the foundations, the big foundations in town. And then in the middle of all that, Eugene Sanders announced he was leaving, and it's very unusual for a school superintendent to leave mid-year. Typically the way it's done is they kind of leave at the end of the year, which is sort of what you'd expect. And that way you can also undertake a search. So that was very, very inconvenient for the school district, very inconvenient, and for the mayor. And so one of the folks at in this case at the Gun Foundation, Dave Abbott, who I was emailing with one day as he announced his departure, he said, and I know he was joking, he said, you want to run the school district? And I said, and I meant it, I said, I'd do that in a heartbeat. Are you kidding? And he said, are you serious? And I said, yeah, I'm serious. How many times in life would you have the opportunity to run on an interim basis one of the largest school districts in the country? When's that ever going to happen again? And I can actually do it, so yeah. And he said, well, do you mind if I mention it to the mayor? And I said, no, go ahead. So he did, and I think he may not have been the only one. The Port Authority experience may have sort of positioned me as, oh, he'll do stuff.
For $1.
Remember those old commercials, those cereal commercial, hey Mikey, he'll eat anything. He'll do anything, and he'll do it for nothing. So, so ultimately, I did get a call from City Hall, And they said, hey, we've got a short list of people we're thinking about, and can you come down? And the short list turned out to be really short because I met with him for like 45 minutes, and then he said, so will you do it? And I said, well, can I go home and talk to my wife? And the next day, I said, sure, I'll do it.
So what'd you do first? What was your first act?
The very first thing, actually, I did it both the school district in a little different way, the Port Authority, because I knew the issues were a little different. But the school district, I met with the management team there, and I said, look, let me make some things really clear to you, as clear as I possibly can, because I can sort of imagine what you might be thinking. You don't have to tell me. I'm just imagining what you might be thinking. So let me ask and answer a few questions that might be on your mind. First, I'm not some amateur education expert who now thinks I get to apply my philosophies of education to a big school district as an experiment. I'm not going to do that. I'm not an educator. I don't pretend to be an educator. I'm not going to try to become an educator. You all are professional educators. That's not my deal. So if you're thinking I'm going to show up and change the curriculum, I'm not going to do that. Secondly, you've just spent a ton of time creating a plan called an academic transformation plan. I said, my read of it is it looks pretty good. Am I going to show up now with a new plan, or do I think we need a whole new plan? I'm not going to do that either. That would be presumptuous on my part as an interim CEO. So the plan's the plan. And I said, and thirdly, you're probably wondering, am I going to show up and change the management team closest to home? And I said, well, you know what, I'm not going to do that either unless somebody does something that just absolutely requires negative attention. So if you're worried about your job, or you're worried about the plan, or you're worried about some amateur showing up, stop worrying about any of those things. We have plenty of other things that we can worry about together, but I'm not here to do any of those things, okay? I'm not a threat to you, in other words. I'm just here to do a job until the permanent person shows up that is, really knows what they're doing to do the job on a long-term basis. And you could practically feel everybody exhale. And those points maybe seem perfectly obvious, but I think oftentimes when people come into new situations, they don't get said. And so everybody sits and wonders or worries or protects themselves. And so that's where we started. And then I spent time with each of them one-on-one to form a relationship. Who are you? Where did you come from? Tell me about let's get acquainted, and who am I? And then I found, again, if you do a few things that need to be done, that should have been done a long time ago, that everybody knows need to be done, just do them. Instantly, there's respect. It's sort of, and credibility. Oh boy, you didn't just show up, to keep the seat warm like and sit there like a potted plant. You're actually going to do some things that they need to be done. Great. And then we move forward, and we had some very significant financial challenges that had to be met. There was no choice. So that was an area where I felt I could add value because I knew something about restructurings and the processes one uses and the advisors one uses and moving through them quickly. And I think one of the things it was able to convey is they were used to taking on financial challenges and thinking about them over months and months and months and months. And I said, you know what, we can do this in weeks, and we have to, but we actually can. And then we did. And I think that I was used to moving at a quicker pace, and I think demonstrated with some process that, hey, we can just move faster. So it's those kinds of things. I think in an interim position in particular, what you don't do is almost as important as what in fact you do.
If I could just remind the audience, if you have any questions, if you want to print them out and take them have them passed down to the ends, and we'll be ready for questions in just a couple minutes. Thanks. Was that the first time you had to deal with a union?
Yes.
How was that?
Yes.
How did you get them to make concessions?
Well, I didn't exactly. All I tried to do was lay groundwork for negotiations because I knew the negotiations were going to go on long after I was gone. And look, so this is the point now where I make this speech that Julie's heard now like 100 times. In the time I was at the school district, I came to very much enjoy teachers. I came to not so much enjoy the teachers' union. I'll just say that. And it's not because I'm anti-union. It's not because I was pro SB 5. I was not. My father was a union worker. I'm not against collective bargaining. I'm none of that. I just think that the historical arrangements that are still in place between the teachers union in Cleveland and the Cleveland schools, like in many cities, are anachronistic. I think they're out of date. I don't think they work anymore in 2012 and beyond, and they have to change, and I think kids are suffering until they do. So this is one man's opinion. That's my belief. So what I tried to do was lay some groundwork as best I could for negotiations that I knew would go on after I was gone. And you know, some of that is hardball stuff. I mean, some of that is, now we needed to shrink. I mean, we laid off a bunch of teachers. We had to. Financially, there was no option. And these would, you know, in many cases, teachers that would never be called back and shouldn't be because the student enrollment had shrunk. One of the questions I asked early on, that's the power of the simple, stupid question, which I'm really, really good at. Very early on when I was at the school district, I said, you know, the enrollment keeps shrinking. How many teachers should we have for our enrollment and the complexion of our enrollment? And you know what? We had no idea. They had no idea. The way it had always gone was you had this many teachers, and then if you had to save some money, you eliminated as many of them as you needed to eliminate to save as much as you needed to save. But there was no matching of the teacher population to the enrollment. And this was sort of mind-blowing to me because it seemed, so we did a ton of work trying to create models and stuff for the first time ever in that school district to, if this is our enrollment and this is the complexion of our enrollment, that should drive the number of teachers we need and want and the types of teachers we need and want. That was a whole new way of looking at it, and not one that the union loved, as you might imagine. So, you know, that was tough. It was an interesting experience, really interesting experience. And it's going to go on and on and on. I mean, this is, you've been reading about continued negotiations, some recent pretty modest concessions. But the financial challenges of that school district, you know, you'll be reading about them again probably soon because they're huge and they haven't gone away. And they're not going to go away until I think some very significant structural changes occur.
So in all of these experiences, now what do you want to be when you grow up? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I thought about it a lot, but I don't know is maybe the best answer. But I'm a lot more comfortable with I don't know than I used to be. And so, you know, I have this. I do this consulting work, which I enjoy. I now sit on the board of a publicly held bank down in Georgia that's an outgrowth of the consulting work, and I've enjoyed that. So I'm around the business that I've been in my career. I've said a bunch of times that I've sometimes likened it to being a grandparent, or maybe I'm not a grandparent yet, and God willing, I don't want to be a grandparent anytime very soon. But I think, you know, people say the great thing about being a grandparent is you get to sort of show up, do stuff, be involved, have an opinion, and then leave. That's sort of what it feels like to be a board member and around the banking industry, and I'm sort of enjoying that. You know, and then we'll see what the future holds.
Okay. All right. You ready for some questions?
Sure.
All right. From a leadership perspective, what did you learn under duress that you could not have learned otherwise?
That's a really good question. Well, I'd say two things. One of which I knew kind of intellectually, but learned very emotionally, and that is there's this old adage about leadership being lonely, which turns out to be true, very true. And I think in times of duress, it's even more true. So having some sort of support system outside of the organization that you're leading, I learned, I mean, I kind of knew it, but I learned in incredibly real and emotional ways that it's very, very important. Because in times of duress, even more so I think than normal times, people are sort of looking to you, not just for leadership, but for cues. You know, how I feel about this has a part to do with how it looks like you feel about it, right? So, so that does sort of convey a sense of loneliness, like I'm kind of in this by myself. And what I learned was, you know, for example, board of directors, they're not there to be your friends. They're there to do their job. The employees can't really, the management team can't really be your friends per se because they're kind of going through it with you and you have a different role. So who are your friends? And, you know, just as a side, one of the things I learned was that, you know, some people who purported to be friends didn't turn out to be real friends and some did. So that's the way these things go. So that was one part. The second part was very interesting to me, and it ties to something I said a moment ago. Projecting calm, even if you're not feeling it. I mean, the acting, frankly, that goes with that, and bottling it up, and then, if you're going to go home and kick the dog or, have a drink or whatever, but staying calm in the midst of all of the upheaval, I found was incredibly important, because literally we had 30,000 people who, in some form or another, were kind of, if you look panicked, I guess maybe it's time for me to get panicked, and if you seem calm, I'll stay calm. And that is, I think, not shocking, but it turns out to be really true. And it's hard because, look, we're all humans, and there were days when I felt anything but calm, anything but calm. Julie will tell you there were, a couple of days when in the morning I said to her, I would give anything not to go to work this morning. I'd give anything not to have to, get in the car and go down to that bank this morning, because I know what I'm going to face this morning, and I don't want to face it. But that's kind of what they're paying me to do, and I need to do it. And actually, after a while, it's not even about that's what they're paying me to do. It's just some people are counting on me to do something. I can't let them down, right? But keeping that all bottled up, I found was quite difficult. I'm not a terribly emotional person, but look, again, we're all humans, and there are days when you just want to say, "Oh my God, this is really rough," or feels like the world's coming to an end, or whatever, and you can't. You just can't. And one of the things I'm quite proud of is I think I did keep a level head throughout, to my knowledge, but it wasn't easy. And there were definitely days when I got home and I just kind of collapsed, because every ounce of energy I had left, at 9th and Euclid.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question. How did you assess the organizations you led to determine the climate before leading change? And what were the biggest learning lessons?
Well, there's a wonderful premise to that question, which I think is worth pausing on, which is taking time to assess before you lead change is really, really important. And I'm struck by how often new leaders don't assess. They just go diving in with no sense of the history of the place or the issues, like the world just started today. And I think that's a huge mistake. So I love the premise of the question. Always tried to be careful about that. And what I found is, again, it's really simple. You just have to take the time to do it. Ask people. It's not that hard. Just ask them. They'll tell you. And they'll love being asked, by the way. Love being asked. Ask, listen. And what I found every time, whether it was retail banking in National City or the Port Authority or the school district, is if you ask a series of people, it is amazing how quickly you can synthesize a picture, because there'll be points of commonality. People will say things in different ways and with different phrasing and language, but it is remarkable how you'll start to hear the same thing again and again and again, and you can have almost 100% confidence that it's real because you're hearing it with consistency. And then it's just amazing. If you just take that, synthesize it, and play it back, this is what I heard. People think you're, oh my God, you're a genius. Well, there's no genius at all. It's just ask and listen. It's not that hard. Although, again, I'm amazed at how often leaders coming into new situations don't ask, or kind of pretend to ask but don't really listen to the answer, which is, I think, really disenfranchising for those who were asked. It's just not that difficult. Just take a little time to do it. And I think part of the art is knowing how much time. Too little is a problem. Too much is also a problem. There's a golden moment in there somewhere when it's time to move on. We've done the asking, we've done the synthesizing, thank you very much, here's what I think about it. And it may not be what everybody wanted or what everybody wished for, but at least they'll know that the process had some integrity to it and some soundness, and now it's time to move along. And I think if there's an art to it, to me, it's that golden moment of when's it time to transition from assessing to moving.
Okay, another question. What was the leadership failure at NCB that led it to being in a position that necessitated the PNC deal, and what could have been done differently?
Wow, that's a great question. And it's something I thought a lot about, just from a learning perspective. what does one learn about from situations like this that are applicable elsewhere? And what I'm not going to do is get into names and who did what or didn't do what or whatever. That just wouldn't be productive and it wouldn't be appropriate. But what I would say is these things tend to be years in the making, I think. Almost always, actually. And I think at the end of the day, the big learning I've had is they are traceable if you keep peeling back at the onion. So a decision was made. Why was that decision made? And then you answer that question. And then some of you maybe have experience with the 5 whys technique, if you've ever used that. And you just keep peeling back why and why and why. And my take on it is that the core you get to is a cultural core. It is a leadership core, but it's what was the culture of the institution that governed how decisions get made, the actions that are taken, the actions that aren't taken. And those things evolve over years. I mean, literally years. And in the case of National City, and again, we don't have the time, and some of it wouldn't be appropriate. But I know in my own mind, I can trace, certain things back literally years. I mean, many years in some cases. But one in particular, and I'll mention it only because I mentioned it a bit earlier, is I think it's really, really important in any organization that the culture encourages, appropriately, but encourages questioning and challenge, even up and down the hierarchy. And banking historically has been a very hierarchical business. It was in transition, as I said much earlier, but historically hierarchical and very much a sense of, people sort of get told what to do. And if they do what they were told to do, they're in a safe harbor. Can't be criticized if I just do what you told me to do. Certainly can't be criticized if I don't do something that you didn't tell me to do. We were trying very hard to change that culture at National City because we knew we needed to for the future. I do believe that some of our issues were traceable culturally back to matters like that. And I think they matter in any organization. Now, you can't have chaos, and at some point decision makers need to be decision makers. But respectful and appropriate questioning, challenging that leads to better decisions in a team context, boy, it seems to me that's got everything to do with why organizations succeed.
What was your biggest mistake in leadership?
Boy, there have been lots of them. One of my biggest mistakes and a huge learning experience for me was in 1996. So it was obviously a formative thing because I can remember this exactly. I became responsible for another business line at U.S. Bancorp at the time. Came into a new business line, and I went through this assessment and asking process I was describing earlier. And it was very important to me to sort of build a team and to have people feel like they were meaningful members of the team and so on. So we'd sit in these meetings and we'd talk about an issue, and people would express their views, and I would think, I need to be careful to let everybody express their views and not overly impact the decision. So I would be relatively silent. And after a few weeks of this, somebody that reported to me, who was ultimately a good friend, came into my office. She shut the door and she said, "You're driving us out of our minds," right? And I said, "What do you mean? You know what I mean? I'm trying to make a good team." She said, "We know you have opinions. For God's sake, your body language screams that you have opinions." And I've always had an issue with body language. She said, "So, you're not doing us any favors by just sitting there silently. Maybe you think this is good for the team, but it's not, right? So if you have an opinion, tell us what it is, okay? And, fine, if you want us to disagree with you, we'll disagree with you, but you got to tell us because you're driving us nuts." And I thought, wow, that was really helpful. It hurt, but, so I sort of changed my style and I'd say, okay, here's the issue. Do I have a bias on this? Yeah, I do. Here's what it is. Now let's discuss it. And what I found is if you can do that a few times and walk out of the room with a different decision than what my bias was coming in, well, then people get that, okay, my opinion does count because we actually did come out with a different decision, but we're not playing games. I'm not being coy. I'm not being, I was coming off as being sort of tricky, and but I always appreciated her doing that, because what would have been really awful is if she hadn't done that, it would have been disastrous, actually. I think one of the big issues about leadership is, and I would say for the students in the room, when you get a leadership job, just know that the position gets you credibility and authority for a short period of time, and then you either build on that with real credibility or you'll lose it. But at some point, if the people don't want to follow, they're not going to follow. And the worst feeling in the world is to be a leader who looks back and suddenly discovers that nobody's following. It happens all the time, just through sheer ignorance and sort of being oblivious. So that was a good example where I could have just marched off thinking I was doing the right thing for a long time probably, and it would have been disastrous. Somebody had the good grace to let me have it, and I really benefited from it. So it was a mistake, a big mistake that I learned from. I can't tell you how many others there have been over the years. To me, the trick was always try not to have them be fatal, and try to learn from them. Don't make the same one twice.
That's good. How do you see the city and area recovering from the slow economy, and what will cause growth here?
Well, I'm no expert on urban planning or urban issues. I think we have more than our fair share of challenges, just given, it's the obvious point that the historical strength of our economy, the historical base of our economy has been eroding for years. Long before a financial crisis of 2007, 2008, the economy here has been eroding. And the sort of big clumps of middle-class jobs that used to be there aren't there anymore, and my own view is they're never going to be again. So the idea that somehow we're going to, reopen, or establish new huge auto factories that employ thousands of people, I just don't think that's going to happen. So there's going to have to be a transition, and I think it is particularly challenging for cities like ours, in Detroit and Toledo and Pittsburgh and others. And some cities have done it better than others. My sense is we're kind of on the right track, although it's really hard sledding. And I do think part of the story has to be leadership, the right kinds of leadership, and in some cases even inspiration. It sure helps a lot when people believe to try to get hard things done. And we could probably benefit from some more of that. There are other cities, I think, that have progressed quicker than we have, and they seem to be better aligned, particularly in many cases between city and suburbs. Cities like Indianapolis and Louisville, where there seems to be less contentiousness between cities and suburbs. Again, I'm no expert on this stuff, but my sense is we're moving in the right direction, but not very quickly. And one of the things I learned at the school district was, while you're working on things that are hard and have very long tails to them, every day that goes by is another day, in somebody's life that's you can't get back. So speed matters.
Did National City attempt to restructure before it was sold to PNC? If not, why?
Oh yeah, I'll just say in dramatic ways that I won't go into details, but we're all public actually at the time. Absolutely. If you go back and look, we were undertaking all kinds of things to dramatically restructure the company, even before the financial crisis. What a lot of people don't remember is at the end of 2006, we had a subprime mortgage company that we very successfully sold, believe it, at the end of 2006, actually to Merrill Lynch, who paid us a ton of money for it. Amazingly, they paid us $1.3 billion to buy that thing, and they shut it down less than a year later and wrote off the entire $1.3 billion. So, we had our challenges. Yeah, they made a few mistakes too. So we, as I said much earlier, we kind of knew where we needed to go and wanted to go. The world in the end became far tougher. The environment was far tougher to get that done than we ever imagined it would be.
Well, one more question. What advice do you have for up-and-coming leaders working in organizations today who aspire to become a CEO?
I guess I have a couple of pieces of advice. One is, I'm not so sure I'd aspire to become a CEO, which doesn't mean you won't become one. But my own experience with people who say their ambition is to become a CEO, I'm not sure that's the healthiest thing. Having it happen for the right reasons over the right time frame, because you've acquired the right skills and experiences and the right accomplishments, to me is kind of more the way it ought to be. So I'm picking on those words a little. I apologize for that. Secondly, people I've known who had, wanted to sort of fashion a master plan for their life or their career, I wouldn't recommend it. One, I think it almost never works. Life's just not, life throws you curves. And some of the curves are positive, and some of them are negative at the time, and then they become positive in the long run. And I think, you want to be ready for those curves and embrace some of them. And secondly, I think, and I guess maybe I say this as a 55-year-old, I'm not sure I would have said it as a 22-year-old entering the workforce, but, part of the joy of being on the earth here is not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. And, it's not always good. Sometimes it's really good, but that's sort of part of what, I think we're about as human beings. The biggest single piece of advice I would give you is whatever you're doing and whatever your aspirations are, whether you take my advice or not about CEO aspirations, but I think the key to me is you must do the right thing at every turn and have faith that doing the right thing will produce the right outcomes. Now, justice doesn't always play out like today or tomorrow, but my experience is that in the longer run, it actually does tend to play out. And usually, people that don't go about it right, it eventually catches up with them. And usually people who do, it eventually works out for them. And I'm not going to claim 100% of the time, but boy, somewhere down the road, I can almost guarantee it. And this now I sound like an old man talking, but, and I guess
No, you're young.
relative to
55
some of
is
you,
young.
But 55, I've been at this for a while. I can almost guarantee there will be moments along the way where you will look in the mirror in the morning, and you got to be comfortable that what's looking back at you like, and you're comfortable with, in terms of your conscience and your integrity, or it's a long, long way to go on some pretty thin ice. And I know that stuff all seems perfectly obvious, but hey, there's points along the way where there are choices to be made. And there are days when the easier choice would be not to do the right thing. We all know that, and might even be expedient, or tempting in the near term. But it's a long road, and whether it's internal to you or the way the external world ultimately treats you, doing the right things and having some faith that it will work out, I think, is just crucial. The day that the National City deal was announced, a true story, last story, we had a Shaker Heights police vehicle parked in our driveway that we didn't ask for. It was sent over because somebody was worried about our safety. Now, I should have probably thought of that, but I wasn't thinking about that at the time. I thought, oh my God, I started to realize, can we even live in this town anymore? Can we live in this city anymore? That was a real question for us at the time, because it was an important institution, and I didn't know what was going to happen from there. I'm pleased to tell you that we have been able to live in the city pretty comfortably, and I'm sure there are people walking around the city of Cleveland who think I'm a jerk. I'm pretty confident that's true, even know who some of them are. But generally speaking, we've been able to be here, and our kids have now graduated from high school and gone on to college and all that stuff. And I think, I believe in my heart that at least some of that's got to do with we tried to do the right things. We tried to be upstanding human beings, and that somebody noticed along the way. I don't know that for a fact, but that's my belief. So that would be my single piece of advice, and particularly coming through the period we've just come through, where some people, it was a very difficult period. Some people made some bad business decisions. Some people just got caught up in a very difficult environment, and some people did some bad things. There's a range, right? But there's no question, some people did some bad things. I suggest it's worth studying that a little bit and making sure that that's never you. Whatever may seem tempting or convenient at the time, because like I said, at the end of the day, at the end of many days actually, many days, you got to live with you. That's all that matters in the end.
Well, Peter,